Hello, and welcome to part 2 of the 3-part video series on unpacking the 2014 Elementary South Carolina Science Standards, or how to figure out what you want your students to do in order to learn what you want them to know. Part 2 is going to focus on the performance indicators and specifically the science and engineering practices that define student performance and how they learn science concepts and science content knowledge. Now, if you recall from part 1, we were looking at the conceptual understandings. So these were the big ideas that students were to develop knowledge and awareness of over the course of a unit. Well, the performance indicators are the things that the students are actually going to do. They define the nitty-gritty of how the students will learn science and what exactly the details of those science concepts are. In part 2, again, we're going to look specifically at the science and engineering practices, the way the students will engage in the process of being scientists and engineers and doing the things that scientists and engineers do in order to develop a knowledge of the big ideas that are defined in those conceptual understandings we looked at before. So let's go ahead and take a look at those. Your performance indicators provide a lot more specific information than the conceptual understanding does, and certainly than just the general broad standard statement itself. Now we're looking at this part specifically in blue that you see over here on the screen. Well, first of all, let's talk about the coding. So similar to the coding we talked about before, you've got 3, which tells you it's a 3rd grade standard, L, which tells you it's life science, 5A tells you it's the 5th standard listed under 3rd grade, and A is the first of the conceptual understandings. If there's more, that would be an A and a B. Now that number 1 and that number 2 tell you that these are the first 2 performance indicators. So 3rd grade life science, 5th standard, A conceptual understanding, and indicator number 1 and indicator number 2. Now what we're going to look at is that part highlighted in blue. These are examples of science and engineering practices. Now, the South Carolina standards defined 9 science and engineering practices that students are expected to engage in to develop their conceptual understanding. Now, those practices are ask questions, develop and use models, which you see here, plan and carry out scientific investigations, analyze and interpret data, construct scientific arguments to support claims, construct explanations, obtain and communicate information, and define problems and design solutions. Now we're looking at just 2 of those here in this example, analyze and interpret data, and develop and use models. Now what these tell you is that in order for students, the way these performance indicators tell you as the teacher that students are going to learn all this information about the characteristics of environments to describe how they can support the variety of organisms is through analyzing and interpreting data. So what they're not going to do is they're not just going to read a whole bunch of books or PowerPoints or video clips about each of these habitats, but they really are supposed to learn about how these habitats support the organisms by analyzing and interpreting data about the characteristics of those environments. So this tells you that students need to be looking at a table with information about an environment, or a graph or a graphic organizer. They could look at a video clip, but you have to be very strategic. That video clip can't just tell them all the information. The video clip could be a source of data depending on how it's used. The key here, though, is that students are gathering data from a variety of sources and then using that data to describe those characteristics and how the environment can support the organisms based on those characteristics. So this isn't about memorizing information about different habitats. It's about using data from those habitats. It's about analyzing data and interpreting data and saying, okay, based on the temperature, based on the type of water, based on the amount of sunlight, these organisms can live here because these organisms are adapted to live in an environment with these characteristics. That's what that line, analyze and interpret data, tells you. And we look at that next one as another example. And I chose these because these are 2 of the most common examples of science and engineering practices in the elementary South Carolina science standards. Develop and use models. This tells you that students are going to develop models of food chains and then use those models to classify organisms as producers, consumers, and decomposers, and describe how organisms obtain energy, pretty much one eating, who eats what and gets energy. Now, what's very important here is that word at the beginning that says develop. Now, that tells you this is not the textbook's food chain model. This is not the PowerPoint's food chain model or Brain Pop, Tim and Moby food. This is a student food chain model developed based on what students have learned about organisms in a particular habitat. And then they're going to use that food chain model to say, these organisms are producers, these are consumers, these are decomposers, and this one gets energy from this one, and this one gets energy from this one, all the way back to talking about the sun, which is the source of energy for photosynthesis. So these are just specific examples. The key here, though, is when you're unpacking the South Carolina standards, usually in these indicators, the very first few words in that statement, that's the science and engineering practice. That needs to be understood so that you understand what kind of tasks your students are going to go through in order to build that knowledge of the content. Now, the good news is in our support documents, in our Richland 2 elementary curriculum and the Elementary Science Explorations Google site, you have links to all sorts of support documents that help you understand what those science and engineering practices look like. But when you're looking at any given standard, the very first part of a performance indicator tells you that's the science and engineering practice. That's the thing I need to see students do to unpack that conceptual knowledge. So that ends this second segment of our video series, Unpacking the South Carolina Science Standards. The third one is going to look at the content of these indicators.